Have you ever wondered what would happen if God put other gods on trial? Sounds strange, doesn't it? A divine courtroom drama where the supreme judge calls out corrupt divine beings? Well, this isn't just imagination. It's precisely what we find in one of the most puzzling and profound passages in the Bible, Psalm 82. In the year 950 BCE, as the ancient kingdom of Israel was flourishing under King Solomon's reign, a mysterious psalm was composed that would challenge our understanding of divine justice for millennia to come. This isn't just another religious text. It's a cosmic courtroom drama where God stands in judgment of other divine beings, demanding accountability for their failures to uphold justice in the world. What do I mean by other gods? That's the fascinating question that has perplexed biblical scholars for centuries, and I'll reveal the answer shortly. Imagine a divine council meeting, high above the mortal realm. The supreme God stands among lesser divine beings, perhaps angels, spiritual powers, or what ancient people considered gods, and delivers a scathing indictment against them. Their crime? Failing to protect the vulnerable and allowing injustice to flourish throughout the earth. This is Psalm 82, a brief but electrifying glimpse into heaven's halls of justice. God stands in the divine assembly. Among the divine beings, he pronounces judgment. These opening words immediately transport us to a celestial courtroom where something unprecedented is happening. God is holding court among what the Hebrew text calls the Elohim, a term that could refer to gods, divine beings, or even powerful human judges who were meant to represent divine authority on earth. But before we dive deeper into this fascinating psalm, let's situate ourselves in the ancient world where it emerged. During the 10th century BC, Israel was surrounded by nations with pantheons of gods. The Canaanites worshipped Baal and Asherah. The Egyptians had Ra, Osiris, and dozens more. The Babylonians revered Marduk. In this polytheistic environment, Israel's monotheistic claim was revolutionary. Not that other divine beings didn't exist, but that Yahweh, the God of Israel, reigned supreme over all. Against this backdrop, Psalm 82 takes on profound significance. It doesn't deny the existence of other spiritual powers, but rather demonstrates their absolute subordination to the one true God, who judges them for their moral failures. The psalm was attributed to Asaph, one of King David's chief musicians, who founded a guild of temple singers that continued for generations. The Asaphite psalms often focus on themes of divine judgment and justice, and Psalm 82 represents perhaps the most dramatic example. Now, let's examine the central accusation God brings against these divine beings. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. This indictment reveals something profound about divine expectations. These beings, whether understood as territorial spirits assigned to nations, human judges, or some other celestial authorities, had one primary responsibility: to ensure justice prevailed, especially for society's most vulnerable members. Their failure wasn't one of power, but of moral character. They had the ability to protect the vulnerable, but chose not to exercise it. Consider the historical context. Ancient Near Eastern societies often saw their gods as capricious, demanding sacrifice and worship without demonstrating moral concern for human welfare. What makes Israel's God utterly distinctive in this environment is his passionate commitment to justice, particularly for society's most vulnerable: widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poor. The concept of justice in ancient Hebrew thought, expressed by the word mishpat, goes far beyond our modern notion of legal fairness. It encompasses the active establishment of right relationships throughout society, ensuring that everyone, especially the powerless, can flourish. When these divine beings failed to establish mishpat, they betrayed their most fundamental purpose. By the 8th century BCE, prophets like Amos and Isaiah were delivering scathing critiques of Israel's society for failing to uphold these exact standards of justice. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals growing economic inequality, with palatial homes being built alongside impoverished dwellings, physical evidence of the very injustice condemned in Psalm 82. But who exactly are these gods being judged? Scholars have proposed several interpretations. First, they could be the supernatural beings thought to govern the nations. In ancient Near Eastern cosmology, each nation had its patron deity or spiritual power. Deuteronomy 32 verses 8-9 in some ancient manuscripts suggests that God assigned different nations to different divine beings while keeping Israel for himself. These national spirits failed in their governance. Second, they might be human rulers or judges who, in the ancient world, were often considered divine representatives. The Hebrew word, Elohim, is occasionally applied to human authorities who were supposed to exercise God's justice on earth. Psalm 82 could be condemning corrupt human leadership that failed to protect the vulnerable. Third, they could represent the false gods of surrounding nations, not as real entities, but as the spiritual powers people worshipped instead of the true God. Their judgment would be a poetic way of declaring their impotence and moral bankruptcy. The most compelling interpretation, supported by ancient Near Eastern parallels and other biblical texts, combines these views. The psalm likely refers to spiritual powers that were believed to govern nations, beings created by God but given authority over regions and peoples. These beings failed in their responsibility and aligned themselves with injustice, becoming the gods worshipped by pagan nations. In the cosmic drama of Psalm 82, we see these beings not only indicted but sentenced. You are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. This pronouncement is shocking. These gods, despite their exalted status as children of the Most High, will die like humans. Their divine status is revoked. Their authority is terminated. They are demoted from immortality to mortality, from divinity to humanity. The judgment is absolute and irreversible. This declaration would have been revolutionary in the ancient world. While neighboring cultures feared their gods and sought to appease them through sacrifice and ritual, Israel's God was proclaiming the ultimate dethronement of these powers. Their claim to divinity was contingent on their justice, and having failed, they are sentenced to death. In Jewish interpretive tradition, particularly as developed during the Second Temple period, 516 BCE to 70 CE, Psalm 82 came to be associated with the idea that the nations had been assigned angelic princes or governors who had corrupted their rule. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered between 1947 and 1956, contain texts that expand on this theme, depicting a cosmic battle between the forces of light and darkness, with God ultimately triumphing over rebellious spiritual powers. When we reach the New Testament period, we find Jesus himself quoting from Psalm 82 in John 10 verses 34 to 36. When accused of blasphemy for claiming divinity, Jesus references this psalm, saying, "Is it not written in your law, I said, you are gods? His use of the psalm suggests that if human judges could be called gods in Scripture because they received God's word, how much more appropriate is divine language for the one whom God sent into the world? The Apostle Paul also seems to draw on this cosmic worldview when he writes in Ephesians 6 verse 12 about struggling against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. These powers and principalities echo the divine beings of Psalm 82 who have aligned themselves with injustice. The psalm concludes with a powerful plea. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. This final verse represents a dramatic shift in perspective, from God as judge of the divine council to a human plea for God to judge the entire earth. It's as if the psalmist, having witnessed this celestial courtroom drama, now urgently calls for God to extend that same judgment to all earthly powers and authorities. This plea reflects the profound tension felt throughout Scripture between the world as it is and the world as it should be. Despite God's ultimate authority, injustice persists. The vulnerable continue to suffer. The wicked still prosper. And so the faithful call out for divine intervention, for God to rise up and establish justice, not just in heaven but on earth. This tension between divine sovereignty and persistent injustice has challenged people of faith throughout history. If God rules supreme, why does injustice continue? If these lesser gods or powers have been judged and sentenced, why do they seem to maintain their influence? The theological response developed throughout the biblical narrative is that we live in an already but not yet reality. God's judgment has been pronounced, but its full implementation awaits the consummation of history. In Christian theology, this is connected to Christ's victory on the cross, which dealt a decisive blow to these powers, but whose full effects are still unfolding in history. The renowned theologian Walter Brueggemann notes that Psalm 82 represents a profound theologizing of politics. It declares that all powers and authorities, whether human or spiritual, are accountable to God's standards of justice. No ruler, no nation, no power structure is exempt from the requirement to protect the vulnerable and establish just relationships. Throughout history, Psalm 82 has inspired movements for justice and reform. During the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century, reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin drew on its themes to challenge the authority structures of their day. Later, during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. echoed its call for divine justice in human affairs. The psalm poses a fundamental challenge to any form of power, whether political, economic, religious, or cultural. Does it protect the vulnerable? Does it establish justice? Does it allow the lowly to flourish? If not, it stands under divine judgment, regardless of its claims to authority or legitimacy. Ancient Hebrew wisdom literature, including many psalms, operates on the principle that the moral order of the universe is not arbitrary, but reflects the character of its creator. Justice isn't just a human ideal, but a divine attribute. When we establish justice, we align ourselves with the cosmic order as God intended it. When we permit or perpetuate injustice, we violate not just human rights, but divine design. Archaeological findings from ancient Israel reveal sophisticated legal systems with special provisions for protecting widows, orphans, and foreigners, precisely the vulnerable groups mentioned in Psalm 82. Inscriptions from neighboring cultures show similar concerns, suggesting that the requirement for rulers to protect the vulnerable was widely recognized, even if often ignored in practice. The Dead Sea Scrolls, particularly the War Scroll, discovered in Cave 1 at Qumran in 1947, developed the cosmic battle theme implied in Psalm 82. They describe an apocalyptic war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, with angelic forces participating on both sides. This reflects the continued development of the divine council concept in Jewish thought. By the time of Jesus, the idea that spiritual powers influence nations had become a common element in Jewish cosmology. Jesus himself refers to Satan as the prince of this world, John 12 verse 31, and Paul calls him the god of this age, 2 Corinthians 4 verse 4, language that echoes the divine beings of Psalm 82 who had aligned themselves with injustice and were therefore subject to judgment. Early Christian writers like Justin Martyr, 100 to 165 CE, and Origen, 184 to 253 CE, interpreted Psalm 82 as referring to fallen angels who had been assigned authority over nations but had abused their power. This interpretation influenced the development of angelology and demonology in Christian theology for centuries to come. During the medieval period, Psalm 82 was often interpreted in light of church-state relations, with theologians arguing that both secular and religious authorities were accountable to divine standards of justice. Thomas Aquinas, 1225 to 1274, drew on this psalm to argue that unjust laws lacked divine authority and therefore did not bind the conscience. In more recent times, liberation theologians have found in Psalm 82 a powerful resource for critiquing unjust social structures. Gustavo Gutierrez, writing in the context of Latin American poverty and oppression, argued that the psalm reveals God's preferential option for the poor, a divine bias toward protecting society's most vulnerable members. Contemporary biblical scholar Michael Heiser has revived scholarly interest in the divine counsel motif, arguing that Psalm 82 and related texts reveal a more complex biblical cosmology than many modern readers recognize. His work suggests that acknowledging these supernatural dimensions of biblical theology doesn't compromise monotheism, but actually enriches our understanding of God's sovereignty. When we read Psalm 82 today, we're confronted with its enduring relevance. The call for justice, especially for the vulnerable, remains as urgent as ever. The critique of powers and authorities that fail to establish just relationships continues to challenge political and economic systems worldwide. Consider these sobering statistics. According to the World Bank, approximately 9.2% of the global population lived in extreme poverty as of 2020. Millions of children remain orphaned or vulnerable. Gender-based violence affects 1 in 3 women globally. Racial and ethnic discrimination persists in virtually every society. Economic inequality continues to grow, with the richest 1% of people owning 43.4% of the world's wealth as of 2023. These realities represent precisely the kind of injustice condemned in Psalm 82. The divine indictment against powers that show partiality to the wicked while neglecting the weak and the needy speaks directly to our contemporary situation. But the psalm doesn't just offer critique, it offers hope. By declaring God's ultimate authority over all powers and principalities, it assures us that injustice will not have the final word. The concluding plea for God to rise up and judge the earth expresses the enduring hope that divine justice will ultimately prevail. This hope has inspired countless movements for social justice throughout history. From the abolition of slavery to civil rights struggles, from anti-apartheid activism to contemporary movements addressing climate justice and human trafficking, people of faith have drawn strength from the conviction that God stands with the oppressed and will ultimately establish justice. The psalm challenges us to examine our own participation in systems of power. Do our economic choices contribute to exploitation or foster flourishing? Do our political allegiances promote justice for all or privilege for some? Do our religious practices align us with God's concern for the vulnerable or distract us with empty rituals? These questions cut to the heart of authentic spirituality. As the prophet Micah declared, what God requires is to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Micah 6 verse 8. Psalm 82 reminds us that this ethical imperative isn't peripheral to faith, but central to it, reflecting God's own character and concerns. The psalm also challenges our tendency to privatize or spiritualize faith. In the biblical worldview, justice isn't just a political issue but a theological one. How we treat the vulnerable reflects our true understanding of God's character. When we ignore or oppress the weak, we contradict our professed beliefs, regardless of our religious observances. Contemporary theologian N.T. Wright observes that Psalm 82 contributes to a biblical theology of power, teaching that all authority is delegated, limited, and accountable. No power structure, whether political, economic, or religious, has absolute authority. All stand under God's judgment and are evaluated according to how they treat the vulnerable. This has profound implications for how we engage with power in our own contexts. It calls us to prophetic critique when power is abused, to advocacy for those who lack power, and to humble exercise of whatever authority we possess, recognizing its delegated and temporary nature. The Psalm's vision of divine justice also challenges popular distortions of spirituality that focus exclusively on individual blessing or prosperity. The God of Psalm 82 isn't primarily concerned with personal enrichment, but with just relationships throughout creation. Authentic spirituality aligns us with this divine concern for systemic justice. Archaeological evidence from ancient Israel shows that periods of religious revival were supposed to be accompanied by social reforms that protected the vulnerable. The prophets consistently condemned religious observance that coexisted with social injustice. Isaiah 58 famously challenges fasting that doesn't lead to loosing the bonds of injustice and letting the oppressed go free. This integration of spiritual devotion and social justice reflects the holistic worldview of ancient Hebrew thought, which didn't separate sacred and secular realms, as modern Western thinking often does. All of life, economic, political, religious, was understood to stand under divine authority and was to reflect divine values. When Jesus began his public ministry, he explicitly connected his mission to this tradition of justice for the vulnerable. In his inaugural sermon at Nazareth, he quoted Isaiah's prophecy about bringing good news to the poor, release to the captives, and letting the oppressed go free. Luke 4 verses 18 to 19. His ministry embodied the justice called for in Psalm 82. The early Christian community attempted to embody these values through radical economic sharing. Acts 4 verse 34 reports that there was not a needy person among them, echoing the ideal expressed in Deuteronomy 15 verse 4 that there will be no one in need among you. This wasn't just charity, but a restructuring of relationships to reflect divine justice. Throughout church history, Reform movements have often been inspired by this vision of divine justice. The monastic movement began partly as a protest against the Church's accommodation to wealth and power. The Protestant Reformation challenged ecclesiastical structures that oppressed the poor through indulgences and other exploitative practices. Social reform movements led by Christians, from the abolition of slavery to labor rights, from civil rights to environmental justice, have frequently drawn inspiration from Psalm 82's vision of a God who judges unjust powers and sides with the vulnerable. As we conclude our exploration of this remarkable psalm, we're left with both challenge and hope. The challenge is to align our lives, individually and collectively, with God's passionate concern for justice. The hope is that God's judgment against unjust powers is certain, even if not yet fully implemented. In a world still plagued by profound injustice, Psalm 82 calls us to faithful witness, to name injustice when we see it, to advocate for the vulnerable, to use whatever power we possess to establish just relationships, and to trust that God will ultimately rise up and judge the earth. The final verse of the psalm becomes our own prayer. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. This is both petition and proclamation, asking God to act while affirming that the whole earth already belongs to the God of justice. It expresses both the already of God's sovereignty and the not yet of its full manifestation. As we close this exploration of Psalm 82, we're invited to join in this ancient prayer, to align ourselves with God's justice, to challenge powers that oppress, to protect the vulnerable in our own contexts, and to trust that divine justice will ultimately prevail throughout the earth. In the divine courtroom of Psalm 82, the verdict against unjust powers has already been pronounced. Their sentence has been declared. Their dethronement is certain. Our calling is to live now in light of that coming justice, to be its witnesses and agents in a world that desperately needs it. Will you accept that calling? Before you go, I want to personally invite you to be part of our growing community here at Prayer Universe. If this video touched your heart or brought you peace, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a prayer or message that can uplift your spirit. But most importantly, I'd love to hear from you. In the comments below, share just one word or phrase of motivation that this video inspired in you, whether it's hope, gratitude, peace, or something else. Your words matter deeply to us because they help guide the content we create for this channel. Together, let's build a space filled with faith, encouragement, and connection. Thank you for being here, and remember, every prayer counts. See you in the next one.